Sorry about this, what a mess. Welcome to one more episode of Hieroglyphs, your channel devoted to art, artifacts, and other things. For today's episode, I wanted to engage in a conversation about art. Yeah, about art. What is art? And why is it that such question stirs so much itchiness, discomfort? Why do people take for granted the definition of art? And why is it that anytime we have that conversation, when someone begs that question, the answer typically is followed by a giggle or by some sort of reaction? What is it about art that makes us so interested, that makes us so curious? And what is the relationship between a piece of duct tape, a banana, and today's topic? I hope I have the answers to all those questions, but for now, I welcome you to continue as we get into one more episode of Hieroglyphs. I don't know what I'm doing. I remember as if it was yesterday when I was in my college classes with my students. One of the first things that we will do in art appreciation or introduction to art history was to all together try to ask and answer the question, what is art? And typically, the type of responses that I will receive will be very honest, very vivid, very eloquent. They ranged from saying that art, in one word, was creativity, imagination, expression, emotion, style, beauty, perception, passion, a testimony of life. And thereafter, as we described or as we tried to define what art was, we will jump into realizing that such conditions, imagination, expression, creativity, emotion, memory, are human emotions. So the other thing that we came to realize with those definitions was that there was no simple, unique, exclusive definition for art. In other words, that art with a capital A does not exist. Art is not something that you can simply grab on your hand and put it on your pocket and just come out with you. There is something else. There is bigger, if you may say, more complex condition that makes something to be called a work of art. And those conditions range from historic conditions to subjective conditions to conditions that also are tied to power, privilege, and what have you. The other element that we realized with our students was that only humans, if humans are the only species capable of imagining, of remembering, of perceiving, of creating, of expressing emotions, then we are somehow accepting that it's only humans who can make, who can produce, who can enjoy and understand art. So at this point, you may be wondering, well, when I get back home after a long day at work, I notice how my cat or my dog with their paws made all these beautiful patterns on their sandbox. That interpretation is your interpretation. The dog or the cat did not intend to create those patterns. And if they did it by instinct, but not with the purpose of making a statement or with the purpose of expressing an idea. Same goes for the trajectory, the flying path of a group of birds during seasons when you see a bunch of birds flying out on the sky. When you notice those patterns that have some relative repetition and some sort of orderly arrangement, you are the one in your mind recomposing and making sense of what the birds are doing. But those patterns are part of who they are part simply of the way they move, but they are not thinking about that. They are not trying to say anything or make a statement. Now that we know that art with a capital A does not exist, now that we know that there is no single absolute definition for art, we have to consider that in order to better understand art making processes, we should ideally consider first time period. When was the piece, when was the artifact produced? When was it created? The context and the peoples who created it. We should also consider, speaking of peoples, the culture and the society that created it. So we started by asking the when. Now we should be asking the where and the whom or for whom was the artwork created. And finally, and perhaps one of the most important elements, is the why. Why was it created? The motivation behind it. But as we will study in this video, the definitions that we give to art depend on different factors that are constantly changing, that are continually evolving. One of the earliest definitions that we can find for art came by the ancient Greeks when they coined the term mimesis, defined as imitation of the real world. The Greeks believed that any form of art, such as poetry, painting, sculpture, theater, should be the imitation of visual experience. Here in this artwork that I display on the screen, we see the myth of Zeuxis and Parrhasius. Zeuxis and Parrhasius competed to choose who was the greatest artist of the two of them. Zeuxis painted a bowl of grapes so deceiving that birds came straight into the painting to peck at the images of fruit. They were convinced that the painted grapes were real. However, by everybody's surprise, the contest was won by Parrhasius and not by Zeuxis, because he, Parrhasius, had painted a curtain over an easel, deceiving Zeuxis and the rest of the audience in the process. Therefore, while Zeuxis deceived the birds, Parrhasius was declared as the true victor and as a more talented artist because he deceived a human. He deceived someone with the ability to think for themselves and not an animal who acts by instinct. That definition, nonetheless, is not necessarily unique or valid today, as we know that there are many artworks out there that do not imitate visual experience. Art, for many centuries, was believed to be the imitation or the representation of life, but today we also understand art as an expression or a communication of a feeling. In more contemporary definitions, art has been defined by art critics such as Arthur Danto or George Dickey as a concept or an idea. In other words, that the art is not the object in itself, but the imagination that comes behind it. We tend to believe, however, that all the art that we see, that we receive today, was intended to be put on display, was intended to be shown publicly in the way that we experience it and that we enjoy it in art museums, in art galleries, in art spaces all over the world. There is nothing farther from that perception. In fact, the figure of museum collections as the existence of a history of art, with capital letters, is quite a recent phenomenon. Art history itself selects, organizes, categorizes, judges, and excludes. How does that process work? At some point in European history, art museums were invented. Taste was invented as a way to determine what was considered worth of artistic appreciation and what wasn't. This acquired taste, synonym with prestige and high class, was accompanied by a sense of cultural and, why not, racial superiority. Needless to say, the art canon has been an entirely European invention. In order to show the outcomes of these ways of thinking, all propelled by rationalistic ideas founded on the Enlightenment, art critics and intellectuals needed a place to display their collections and to show off their possessions. And that place was no other than the salon. Salons consisted of annual exhibitions organized under the control of institutions that ruled the realm of the fine arts. Works of art for these spaces were commissioned to enhance and expand the sense of luxury, refinement, and possession carried by those in power. Academies around the 1500s and salons, consequently around the 1600s, intended to spread and impose the idea of an art worth preserving and enjoyed, as opposed to the ordinary, tasteless, and mundane expressions of the irrational mind. This is the mobs, the masses, the commoners, the poor, and the underrepresented. The underdogs did not have a place in the now so selective world of art. Salons, in this sense, were only meant to please and place in a better position the social roles and public image of the monarchy. In a way, art was used as an instrument to persuade audiences into buying the idea that there was some good, high art, as opposed to the uneducated, untrained, or overly popular, quote unquote, low, cheap art. One of the purposes of the Academy was to reveal, but also to improve through the arts, the flaws, the imperfections of society. And one effective way of doing this was through the renewal of an ancient discipline known as aesthetics. Aesthetics, understood or rather defined as the study of beauty. Training or educating the eye also involved an artificiality of taste and a completely fabricated concept of beauty and art. From this point onwards, art became an acquired taste rather than a spontaneous human expression. In other words, the act of learning to see constituted a distinction between what could be defined as fine and what should be undermined as low, popular, cheap, or ordinary. Also, we should consider that colonialist projects emerging from the West found their way through this process of creating the art canon. It was crucial for the wealthy, for the ruling classes, to validate and legitimize imperial practices through the acquisition, or rather the theft, of artifacts to be claimed as works of art. By traveling, by sacking, or by using images, this is photographs, it became easier to disseminate the message of a grandiose Western culture and to undermine, on the other hand, ancient traditions from other civilizations ruled by imperial and colonial means of power, such as India, some parts of Asia, or some colonies in Africa. Observations are useful as they shed light as to why, when we go to a major museum such as the Louvre in Paris, or the Metropolitan in New York, or the British Museum in London, in the same space we find a juxtaposition of objects that range from utilitarian objects to paintings, sculptures, or other artifacts that were intended from the get go to be put on display. On the screen, we see the vase or the vessel known as the women at the fountain house from the ancient Greeks, from the 1500s before our contemporary era. This was made by an anonymous painter, or no one really knows who that person was, but he described himself as an ad painter. And this is a great example of an art piece that was intended to be used by a community without commercial value. In ancient Greece, objects created to store food were often ornamented as a sign of respect and gratitude to the gods who provided the food sources. What are the figures within the Greek Hydra doing? Apparently, they are collecting liquid. The liquid is water, and the water comes from a well with a tap in the shape of a donkey or what seems to be also a lion's head. These objects, this type of pictures, were meaningful to the communities who created them, because these objects function not simply as vessels or as water containers or pitchers, they were also teaching devices. The shape of the pitcher, the handles, the body of the artifact as a whole, resembles a human shape, the shape of those carrying the pitchers. And this whole idea that the object is connected to its function is key, because what is telling us is that the artifacts were not temporary, were not disposable, as in today's consumer society, where food packaging and containers are used and getting rid of right away. A vessel or a pitcher like this could last decades, even hundreds of years. The ritual, the symbolic value for this community is tied to the functional value. This object was intended to be used, it was not intended to be exhibited. And once again, and perhaps most importantly, the shape of the object relates to its function. The value comes from the effort to collect the water, to carry the water on your hands, to place it on top of your head. So all the description, all the visual description is telling the user not just the significance of the picture for the community, but also the way of using and carrying safely the picture for its final destination. The concept of the artist as an individual genius didn't exist here. Artists were rather considered as craftsmen or as artisans and were simply replicating or emulating pre-existing or commissioned motifs. That doesn't imply that they were not talented. In fact, they were very skillful at their labor. They received good training from a master at a workshop for many years. What this says instead is that their skill was devoted to accurately copying and continuing a tradition dating back hundreds of years. The value of the object was determined by how important or meaningful those pieces were for the community. Reason why their fame as individual artists was completely irrelevant. Different case as Leonardo da Vinci with the famous Mona Lisa. But think about this. Why is the Mona Lisa famous? Is the Mona Lisa famous because of the painterly qualities of the composition itself? Or is it famous and considered as the most important painting in the history of Western art because of other external factors? It seems that for artworks like this, the value of the painting was rather determined by the identity of the artist and by the fame achieved by the artwork in terms of everything that has been said or published about it, by museums, by art critics, by historians, by mass media. And to understand that pivotal moment that changed the way we relate to, we define, we have to look at what was it that changed it. Mass production. The emergence of means of mechanical reproduction after the possibilities brought by the industrial era between the 18th and the 19th century onwards. Mass production made works of art available anywhere without the necessity of going to an art museum to experience it. In the words of Walter Benjamin, works of art now come to us. We don't have to go to the places that display artworks anymore. And in which shape do works of art come to us? They come to us in the shape of reproductions, in the shape of prints, in the shape of digital photographs, if we talk about 2026. At this point, we seem to have identified a difference if we go back to the example of the women at the fountain house between artifact and work of art. It seems, as we look at the definition, that an artifact has a functional value. An artifact is intended to be used, responds to a necessity, it has communal, cultural, and ritual bonds, not intended to be put on display, not intended to be disposed. The meaning is collective, the meaning is shared and passed on generation after generation. And the formal and symbolic configuration of an artifact is a skill that is learned, that is shared also through tradition. Tradition prevailing over innovation, prevailing over individual genius, which is what changed or what now began to happen around the 17th century in Europe with art academies and salons. What is an artwork based on these definitions? An artwork, in the way academies and salons defined it, attempted to define it, is rather a commercial or a personal enterprise intended to be displayed, intended to please the senses of those who commission the production of those artworks. So in that sense, artworks respond to a rather personal, a highly refined taste, not to a necessity. Artworks are not intended to be functional. Artworks are intended to be contemplated and to please the senses. Artworks respond to standardized, to academic, and to selective standards, and they're not linked to collective or community-based ways of thinking or ways of doing. They are rather connected to prestige, to acquired taste and to social status. As I say here, not for nothing, European art academies were founded during the days of the Enlightenment around the 1700s. And finally, if we were saying before that artifacts are based on craft and on collective ways of knowing, of sharing, of training, artworks for salons and academies are based on expertise, on skills that are learned through professional or academic training. Innovation and uniqueness in this case prevail over tradition. It could be said that one of the first artists in relatively recent times who realized the discrepancy in the definitions that we have for art was Marcel Duchamp. In 1917, when he came up with his infamous fountain, a simple urinal that he acquired at a plumbing manufacturing company in New York City. He altered the title. He turned 45 degrees the object to exhibit it in an art gallery in New York, and with this he caused lots of controversies. He was confronted by the jury at this exhibition, to which Mr. Marcel Duchamp responded, well, why isn't this accepted as a piece of art if it is an object, if it has a title, it has formal qualities, it has a signature, I paid the entry fee, and it's here in a gallery meeting all the requirements. What Duchamp did here was a brilliant move on how we define artwork and what we understand as the materials and the concepts behind an artwork. What Duchamp is suggesting is that an artwork can be made out of anything, and our industrial mechanized world is filled with extraordinary objects that can be simply grabbed and altered in its essence to convey something else. If Leonardo da Vinci decided to paint the Mona Lisa around the Renaissance era, was because those were the realities and the materials available to him around that time. Duchamp questions the foundation of what a work of art stands for. He questions the nature of the ready-made as lacking uniqueness and originality, which for academic standards are crucial principles for art making. The Fountain by Duchamp is a mass-produced piece. A urinal can be found in almost any public washroom, and it has been used. It is a familiar object. On top of that, Duchamp added value thanks to an added signature and a twisted title. The object is not a urinal anymore. It doesn't function as a urinal. It's rather a fountain. And finally, what Duchamp is reminding us is that the aesthetic and the creative value of the object, the idea behind the object, prevails over its functional purpose, and that the act of creation, the idea, the craft, plus the spark in the artist's imagination is a very similar or even more complex process than the act of creating a quote-unquote work of art. The aesthetic value here is pinpointed because the object has been suppressed from its natural environment and primary function. If it is not a work of art, then what is it? Think about the question for a second. Marcel Duchamp does something with a urinal that he twists 45 degrees. We already talked about that. People react even to this day and they say, this is not a work of art. If you say categorically that something is not a work of art, implicitly you are suggesting that you know what a work of art is. You are suggesting and you are accepting that there is one single definition for it. But there isn't. And that's precisely what Duchamp is trying to demonstrate with that piece. You may like it, you may not like it. We're not talking about taste here. That's not the point of the discussion. The point of the matter is that Duchamp is raising a question that seemed to be avoided, or rather sort of skipped for hundreds of years. And it was only the Greeks, remember, who tried to define what art was. In fact, the Greeks did not have a specific word for it. The Greeks defined the process of making something with an intended purpose as techne, but they didn't really treat it art in the same way that we treat it. In the 20th century, by the time Marcel Duchamp came up with Fountain, the art world and the public in general terms realized something very interesting. It seems that Duchamp opened an unprecedented chapter in the history of art to realize that the art making process does not necessarily go hand by hand with the commercial value or with the commercial significance and the market value of a piece of art. This is quite significant because the conversation, as what happened with Duchamp in 1917 with Fountain, boils down to what happened in 2019 with Maurizio Cattelan and his infamous banana. Cattelan did something very similar as to what Marcel Duchamp did, but I will just summarize the anecdote for the purpose of this video. I don't want to extend too much, and I want to spend a whole new video on Cattelan's banana. In a nutshell, Cattelan made in 2019 news all over the world when he took a ripe yellow banana, a piece of duct tape, and joined the duct tape with the banana and pasted the banana in the wall of an art gallery in the context of Art Basel on that year. The piece was put on auction and sold for $120,000. It was everywhere in the news, and apparently it became what people call today viral. The question is, what made the banana piece famous? And why, or what was Cattelan trying to say with that? Fast forward a couple years later, that piece was sold for $6.2 million to an art collector and a cryptocurrency investor who decided to detach the banana from the wall, peeled it off, and decided to eat the piece. Here's the thing. The artwork are not the bananas. The collector ate one banana that at the end of the day, at some point, was going to ripe, was going to get bad, was going to get spoiled if it wasn't eaten. It's a living organism. Imagine this is a fruit, it expires, it perishes, it becomes compost. The artwork was not the duct tape alone either. In a similar move as with Marcel Duchamp, Catalan is not titling the piece as Banana. Catalan is titling the piece Comedian. Comedian as in comedy, as in a joke. And it baffles me that I have not read lots of reports as to why the piece is called Comedian and not Banana, or Banana stuck on a wall with duct tape. And I also find it fascinating why people haven't commented more on the choice of using duct tape, an industrial, mass-produced object, to be attached and to be glued, to be stuck with an organic object from nature like a banana. Industry and nature. Where is the art? And what is art after all?